Thanks. Yeah. All right, we're live. Hi, thanks for coming. This is great to have such a great turnout to talk about history. I think you guys are much more enthusiastic than my 18-year-old freshman students. So I appreciate you all coming out here. Like Phil said, I've been working on the river since 2005. I've been working for Outward Bound. You can go to the next one. For 12 years now. It's probably too long, but it's still a great place to work. And when I'm not on the river for them, I've worked on the Colorado, the Yampa, and the Green, all over the Colorado River Basin. And I've also floated rivers in the Pacific Northwest and all throughout the West. Those are my boating credentials. My academic credentials, why I'm talking about history. I am a doctoral candidate at CU Boulder, working on my dissertation. It's almost done, writing the final chapter, so it's getting there. And I get to do, this is what my research looks like. So it doesn't suck. And I give a lot of talks to various audiences. I think you guys are probably the most fun. This was at the Colorado River Upper Basin Forum last week, talking about policy and recreation's role in policy. And my dissertation more broadly looks at the Colorado River Basin as a transnational river. So how knowledge about the Colorado River has moved around the world through policy, through infrastructure, and through recreation. So today I'm just going to be talking about a kind of small slice of that, of my research. Go to the next one. I'm just talking a little bit, I'm talking about recreation today, and I'm talking about recreation moving overseas. So this is a pretty small slice of what I do on the whole. But I'm going to talk about recreation moving overseas from the Colorado River Basin to other places in the world. And there are lots of other ways that boaters have that the sport of boating has grown. There's lots of other places that it's grown. There's lots of other international exchanges that have happened. But I'm going to talk specifically about the Colorado River Basin. And that's up here. I'm sure many of you are pretty familiar with the Colorado River Basin. Obviously, we're up here close by Denver. How many of you have floated the Green? Okay, how about the Yampa? Okay, how about the Colorado? The San Juan? Okay, cool. How many of you have gone boating overseas? Okay, a little bit smaller crowd. Cool. And I'm going to talk about a few other rivers around the world, but for the most part, I'm going to focus on the Indus River. You can go to the next one, in Pakistan. And that's going to be kind of our touchstone as we move through this history. First, I'm going to talk about how river running kind of grew up on the Colorado River in the 20th century, starting a little bit in the late 19th century, through the 20th century into the later 20th century. And then I'll talk about how those skills and that kind of knowledge went overseas to rivers around the world, and in particular the Indus. I'll show you one clip of the Indus, running the Indus in 1956. And then we'll have a longer film, go to the next one, called Inside the Indus, of November 2016 attempt on the Indus River last year. These guys just got off the Indus yesterday again, I think, and they said they had another successful trip. So we'll watch that at the end of the talk, and then there will be time for you guys to ask questions that I may or may not know the answer to. But boaters make stuff up, right? That's what we're good at. Never. Go to the next one. Go to the next one. So river running in the Colorado River Basin, I'm sure you guys have all heard of this guy, John Wesley Powell, on the left. And river running as we know it, as we think of it today, started with John Wesley Powell. There's some stories, some tall tales of some folks potentially running the river before Powell did. But really, when we think of folks going down the river in boats, we think of John Wesley Powell. How many of you have heard of Robert Brewster Stanton? There on the right, a couple folks. Okay, cool. Yeah, he was an author. He wrote about the Colorado River as well. And in the late 19th century, in the late 1800s, folks were going down the river mostly for exploration and for trying to make a living off the river or from the area, but not through boating. John Wesley Powell first went down the river in 1869. He had a second expedition a few years later. And he was going out there to see what was out there, right? He called it the great unknown. Nobody really knew what was in the Colorado River Basin. And so he went down there to see what was there. It was kind of the last blank spot on the map for Anglo-Americans in the country. And he had some successes, some mishaps along the way, right? He lost a couple of his crew. But he went out there to see what was there, to see what the resources were like. He turned into an advocate for thinking about conservation. How do we use water wisely in an arid land? And other folks went out there as well looking for ways to explore the river and for ways to use the river and to use that environment. Robert Brewster Stanton was an engineer, and he went looking for, he floated from Green River, Wyoming, through down to Yuma, California, which is kind of near the Imperial Valley, or sorry, Yuma, Arizona. And he was looking for a river-level railroad route. He still believed in it, I think, to the day he died, but some folks who went down there after him were like, oh, that's not really gonna work, dude. And so he floated through the Grand Canyon in 1889 and 1890, looking for that river level route for a railroad survey. There were a lot of other folks who were out floating in the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century. How many of you know the name Nathaniel Galloway? Yeah, a few folks. He is well known for having the brilliant idea to look downstream when you're rowing, which a lot of folks hadn't really thought to do before. When I talk about boat design, I'll talk a little bit about why maybe folks hadn't done that. So Nathaniel Galloway, he was out on the rivers because he liked it, yeah, but he was out trapping beaver and he was prospecting. So at this time, the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th, these are folks who, you know, maybe they like being out on the river. Powell didn't. He didn't like running rapids. He found them tiresome and tiring. They often had to portage. He didn't have to actually run that many of the rapids in the Grand Canyon. So as much as us boaters like to think of Powell as kind of the patron saint of Colorado River running, he didn't really like it. Sorry to burst your bubble on that one. But some of the other folks did. Nathaniel Galloway did. I don't know about Stanton. I think he was okay with it. He had some tragedies on his trip as well, though. Go ahead and go to the next one. And then in the 1920s and the 1930s, people started running rivers for different reasons. They started going out there because it was fun. And you guys have probably heard of a few of these names. Buzz Holmstrom in 1937 and 1938. In 1937, he became the first person to run all of the Green and the Colorado solo. In 1938, he went back. He had a partner, Amos Berg. And they floated they hiked into the Wind River Range and floated as soon as they could get a boat in, they floated all the way down to Hoover Dam. There's a great picture, I didn't include it here because I didn't have a good quality image, of Buzz floating his handmade wooden boat down and bumping it into the back of Hoover Dam and looking up at Hoover Dam. And he did it because he wanted to be out there. He did it just to go boating. He was from Oregon. He was a gas station attendant. He built his own boats in the model of drift boats, Mackenzie River boats, up in Oregon. He first ran the Rogue River, and then he decided to go for some bigger stuff and ended up on the Colorado. Norm Nevels came out to the Four Corners area, to Mexican Hat, Utah in the early 1920s, mid-1920s. And he helped his dad out with some mining prospects. So still folks who are out there looking to make a buck. But he started floating the river in 1932. And he thought it was pretty fun. And so he started working as one of the first hireable guides on the Colorado River. And he started one of the first commercial companies on the Colorado River. He also was one of the first folks to take scientific expeditions down, or one of the early folks. He took a woman named Elzada Clover. She was a botanist from, I don't remember which university, but he took her and her assistant down to do some scientific studies. The group dynamics on that trip weren't great, but he brought some other folks down as well. It was her expedition, and he kind of took it over. And then finally we have Bus Hatch, and there's a lot of other folks who are out running the river during this time, but these are folks who are examples and who are illustrative of kind of what's going on at this time. And we're going to be spending a lot of time with Bus Hatch this evening. He's going to take us all the way to the Indus River and kind of start off this movement of going boating, going overseas for the purpose of going boating, even though it wasn't really his idea to head over to Pakistan. And Bus is from Vernal, Utah, northeastern corner of Utah, right by Dinosaur National Monument. So right almost on the banks, close to the banks of the Green River. And growing up in Vernal, he wanted to go explore what else was out there. He wanted to go see what were in these canyons that were upstream and downstream of where he fished. If you've been on Lador or on the Yampa, he would hike into Jones Hole and go fishing. He would ride his horse into Echo Park, do some fishing and hunting up there. And he always would go to these places and wonder, like, what's upstream, what's downstream, and how do I go figure that out? he actually met up with Nathaniel Galloway's son Parley when Parley got picked up, I think, for not paying child support in Vernal. And while Parley was held in the Vernal jail, he and Bus talked a lot about boat design and sketched out some drawings. And so Bus and his buddies and his family went out and built a boat, and they decided they're going to go see what's in these canyons that are in their backyard. So in 1931, Bus took his first trip. They started up kind of where Flaming Gorge is today, just south of Green River, Wyoming, and floated all the way down through Lador Canyon, through Split Mountain Canyon, and out towards Vernal. They had some problems with their boat design. They didn't really know what they were doing. They tried to run Hell's Half Mile. They portaged a bunch of other ones, put some holes in their boat, but he was hooked. He and mostly him, some of his family was into it. Some of his family was like, never again, you're crazy. But Bus was hooked. And he became one of the first commercial guides in the country, and one of the best known in the kind of mid to late 20th century. And he started taking some paying customers during the 1930s as well. He had a friend named Dr. Fraser who would, pay him to bring his boats out and go float the Middle Fork of the Salmon, go float the Grand Canyon, float the Green and the Yampa. But this was not large-scale commercial boating. And so why didn't that take off? If folks are starting to enjoy the river and if folks are starting to have a good time out there, why isn't this taking off quite yet? There's a few things that are going on. First, we had the Great Depression, right? Folks don't have a lot of expendable income. They're not super mobile. They have a hard time getting out and traveling. There's not a lot of mobility or a lot of prosperity to go around, and this kind of stuff costs money. And second was World War II, right? Started close on the heels of the Great Depression, during the Great Depression. And so resources, rationing, personnel, men were off fighting in the war. There was gas rationing, and so folks just couldn't get out on the rivers. And another reason that folks were not able to build a life around, build a business around commercial guiding, go ahead to the next one, were wooden boats. So let's rewind a little bit to John Wesley Powell's trip. These are two photos of his boats. He had them custom designed. They weighed 2,000 pounds each. I mean, there's some heavy boats at Outward Bound, and they might be close to that. But these were not designed for whitewater. So these are they're called Whitehauls, the design, and they were made for rowing in flat water. You can move really fast on a lake on the East Coast, but they're not really designed for moving in whitewater. They're not designed for maneuverability. They're really heavy. And the biggest problem is that they had a round hull. It's not great for stability, right? You want a flat bottom on whitewater so that your boat's not going to tip over. But Powell's boats are really heavy. They have a round hull. They can't fit a lot, right? You can see that you can maybe squeeze a couple, maybe 3 people on them. But in terms of bringing supplies and people along, there's just not a lot of space. Buzz Holmstrom, in the 1930s, Bus built his boats after Galloway's design. I don't have a picture of that one up here. Buzz Holmstrom, like I said, he based his boat design off of the Mackenzie River drift boats from the Pacific Northwest. And this was a design that nobody had really seen down on the Colorado River before. And you can see his are much more stable, right? This one in particular, I think this is his first one and this is his second one, is much wider. It's much more stable. He also is rowing downstream, maybe not in this picture, but so he can see where he's going. Whereas with Powell and some of the earlier boaters, they figured that they were better off trying to row as fast as possible and beat the current that way rather than maneuvering with the current. So Powell would have, you can see this is his chair sitting up on the deck, which I'm sure made that boat ever more stable. He would sit up there and yell and point while someone's rowing backwards downstream. I don't know, I would be terrified if I were rowing that boat, and then I don't know maybe it'd be better than seeing what you're going into. But these kind of boats and the boating technique before Galloway depended on people moving really fast and kind of outpacing the current to be able to maneuver in the water. Folks like Holmstrom and Bess Hatch and the Galloways, they wanted to be able to see where they're going. And so Galloway developed that stern first technique along with more stable boats. Galloway's boat design really helped with that as well. Norm Neville's came up with these cataract boats. You can see here, this is one that's been rebuilt and is still in use today. It's called the Wen. They'll take it out on one river trip per year. Those are called cataract boats. They're still not very big. And wooden boats had some other problems, right? When a wooden boat meets a rock, this is why I don't row dories, right? You can have some problems. You can sink your boat. So they're fragile. Folks who maybe thought about going on a river trip would think they're not that safe, right? Because they seem more fragile. So they had a perception of not being very safe. They were pretty hard to repair and could be very laborious to repair. And one of the other problems, as you can see, particularly with the cataract boat, there's just not a lot of space on them. These boats could not carry enough people for guides to make money. At the most, they could carry maybe 2 other people besides the person rowing. And dories, we've come a long way in the design of dories. You can carry some more people, right? But dory trips generally need a baggage boat or 2 along with them. And the rafters are going to complain that the dories aren't carrying anything, right? So you just couldn't take enough people to make your trip profitable with these wooden boats. Go ahead to the next one. And so the hatches, this is Don on the, Bus on the right with his son Don. Bus had 3 sons, Don, Ted, and Frank. Frank got out of the family boating business. Don and Ted stayed in there for the rest of their lives for Hatch River expeditions. And Bus, after World War II, he worked outside of Salt Lake City during World War II as a contractor. He was a carpenter by trade. And then after World War II, he thought, okay, I want to get back into this river running thing. And how can I do this more profitably? How can I make a business out of this? Is this even possible? And what he and Don stumbled upon, and he's not the only one doing this at the time. There are other folks who are starting to think about using these boats. They realized that they could use rubber Army surplus boats, and they could fit a whole lot more people on these boats. And the benefits of rubber boats, not only can they carry more people, you can see this one up here, there's only 3, 4 passengers, 5 passengers maybe, but you could fit a lot more people on that boat. They could carry a lot more people. They could carry a lot more gear. They were easier to repair. They were safer in some senses, and they certainly seemed safer to a public who didn't really know much about river running. And they were really cheap, and they were a lot lighter. So they could pick up these boats for super cheap after the war and start putting them into service on the river. And they used a variety of different boats. They didn't use these little 7-mans very much. You can see they're just not very big. But for the most part, they use these. This is a 10-man assault raft and then a 27-foot pontoon boat. And the 10-man assault rafts and the 7-man as well, they were used in the Pacific mostly when folks wanted to make a really quiet landing on a beach, so they didn't have to use motors. They could get dropped off of a naval ship further out to sea, and they could row in. They didn't have to use motors. They wouldn't attract as much attention. And they're designed to carry 10 people and 2,000 pounds of gear and people together. So they could hold a lot of people. They could hold a lot of stuff. These boats up here, these are 27-foot. They could be 27 feet or 33 feet, which sounds awful to row. Pontoon boats. These are bridge pontoons. If you go to the next slide, you can see here, these are the boats. They're putting them together for a bridge pontoon. Go ahead and go back to the last one. And so the hatches would build wooden frames on them and have 2 oarsmen. They were always men at this point. 2 oarsmen rowing. Sometimes they'd put a motor on the back, a motor or 2, but they would have 2 oarsmen on there, and they could fit a ton of people on those and a whole lot of gear. They look really unwieldy to row. And especially the bridge pontoons, the assault rafts as well, they were designed with multiple chambers so that if they got punctured by gunfire, they wouldn't sink. And this proves really useful, right? This is still how our boats are designed today. We have multiple chambers in them, so if we hit a rock, hit a stick, something, and one punctures, we can still float, right? The boat's not going to sink. And so this proved really useful to the commercial rafting industry. And it allowed the hatches to become one of the first successful commercial river running companies. Bus still had his day job. Don was a school teacher in Salt Lake City. Bus was a carpenter, and they still kept those jobs, but they were starting to be able to make money. Go to the next one. So what's going on? Why are people interested in boating all of a sudden at this time? So first we have this technology, this military technology that I was talking about. We have the bridge pontoons, we have the assault rafts. And this is happening in outdoor recreation more broadly. The 10th Mountain Division, there's all this new kind of technology that's coming out of the war and getting put to use in outdoor recreation at this time. And it's allowing people to get outside with, pretty cheap new technologies. They can stay dry and safe and warm more easily than they could before. There's also increased infrastructure, right? The Interstate Highway Act was passed in the mid-50s, 1955, by Eisenhower. That allowed for bigger roads that let people move around the country more easily. There was a big debate whether a highway was going to go what is now I-70, a major interstate highway like that. It almost went where Highway 40 is now up north. And a lot of folks in Vernal were arguing for that to bring tourists to their part of the state. So we have increased infrastructure after the war. People can move around more easily. There's increased prosperity after the war, right? The Great Depression's over, rationing is over. People can move, they can go and get as much gas as they want. They can go travel. They have the money to do that. And there's this increased visitation to national parks that come out of this, right? This is Old Faithful, obviously, in Yellowstone. And so much so that the National Park Service passed something called Mission 66 that was passed in 1956 that was a whole slate of new infrastructure projects for parks that would be done by 1966 to handle this increased visitation. They didn't really know what to do with this. The Park Service was, and all public lands were really caught off guard by this influx of recreationists who were coming to visit public lands. And these folks are really interested in getting out and trying new kinds of sports, and whitewater rafting is a big part of that. Because of, how many of you have heard of Echo Park Dam in the mid-1950s? Yeah, so in 1946, I think 45, the US Bureau of Reclamation put out a big report that's called the Blue Book. I don't remember exactly what the title is. It's called the Blue Book of all the proposed projects. And one of them was Echo Park Dam that would have been at the confluence of the Green and the Yampa in Dinosaur National Monument. And that was Buss and Don's home rivers, right? And they fought really hard against that. But what Echo Park also did was spark people's interest in getting out into the wilderness and getting out into national parks. So this wilderness movement, the Wilderness Act would be passed in 1964, also fueled an interest in getting outside and enjoying people's public lands. So the Hatches found themselves kind of overwhelmed by this, right? They are running a successful commercial company. Go ahead and go to the next one. They would take trips of 60 to 80 people down the Yampa and Lador. There aren't a lot of other people out there, so maybe it's not quite as impactful as we think, but they were cutting down trees for firewood at that time. And they would often take them on these big, you can see the big 27-foot-long pontoons. And you can see this, I know this is a fuzzy picture from a film from 1953, but there's a lot of people on that boat. They could carry a whole lot of people and make a lot of money off of this. And so this sport is really exploding. We also have, these are early kayaks, they're called fold boats. You would transport them by taking the frame out inside and folding it up, and then this watertight canvas would fold up, and then when you got to the river, you'd expand it and get in and float. I don't know that I want to paddle one of those. But that was also expanding in popularity as well, all over the world too. Fold boating became really big in Europe. So rafting is on the public's radar now. People know about it. People are excited to get out and try it, right? And so you have this public that is kind of primed and ready to be getting out onto the river. And this catches someone's attention. Go ahead to the next one. This guy, Lowell Thomas. How many of you have heard of this guy, Lowell Thomas? How many of you may have heard him on the radio? Yeah, he was a really well-known radio broadcaster in the middle of the 20th century. And early in the summer of 1956, Lowell Thomas called up the Hatches and said, hey, do you guys want to go to Pakistan to help me work on this film? I want to shoot a film there and I want rafting to be a part of it. And Lowell Thomas, he's able to do this because he's this really well-known broadcaster and he's also a documentary filmmaker. He got his start, his big breakthrough was in 1918. During World War I, he was stationed in the Middle East and he ran into this guy that we now know of as Lawrence of Arabia. He followed him around, all around the Middle East, and he came home and wrote With Lawrence in Arabia. It was a book and it was also a traveling road show. And this is how Thomas became really famous. This is why we all know the story of Lawrence of Arabia. And he went on from that to become, have this huge illustrious career in radio broadcasting. He also got involved in filmmaking. Go ahead to the next one. And one in particular, some of his stuff from World War I, from World War I, when he came home, he made what I think are probably the first narrated documentaries. But at the end of World War I, people didn't want to see him. Lawrence of Arabia was an exception. It was the only thing that kind of took off. But at the end of World War I, folks weren't that into it. But he got into some other documentary filmmaking in the 30s and 40s. And then in the early 1950s, he discovered this new technology that he invested heavily in called Cinerama. Have any of you ever seen a Cinerama film? It's like the early IMAX. And it's a three projector kind of technology. And it's the first to use surround sound. It's the first to try and immerse the viewer into this film. It was developed by a guy named Fred Waller, who in the 1930s, he starts working with this technology to figure out how to fully immerse someone into a film. He would walk around, his kids would say, with like toothpicks taped on the sides of his hat so he could figure out where the edge of his peripheral vision was and how much of it, like how wide a screen would need to be to encompass that. And it actually got pressed into service during World War II as an artillery, a gunnery trainer. It would teach machine gunners how to shoot down aircraft. And so they would use it as this kind of 3D simulator almost to teach World War II pilots, or World War II machine gunners how to shoot down aircraft. So the first film that came out that was in popular culture, not in military use anymore, was called This Is Cinerama. There was no storyline, there was nothing like that. It was just all these clips of, look at what this new technology can do. And by far the most successful and most popular part of that was a roller coaster ride. And people thought that this was amazing. It was the Atom Smasher at Rockaway Beach. And folks would, some people got motion sickness in the theater and they would have to leave. Like, this was a whole new experience. Today we wouldn't think anything of it. But folks had never been in that kind of almost virtual reality before. Go to the next one. So one of Thomas's next projects after This Is Cinerama, I think he made one or two other films in there, was to go to Nepal to see the coronation of King Mahendra in 1956. He was invited to be part of America's diplomatic presence at King Mahendra's coronation. And he thought, well, I'm going to Nepal anyway, why don't I just go ahead and film it? And in order to do that, to get some backers, he came up with a storyline. It's not a very good one. The film is pretty painful to watch. It's two Air Force pilots who are retiring. They're not sure if they want to sign up for another stretch with the Air Force. So they go over to search for Shangri-La, and they spend time traveling around Asia trying to find paradise. And of course, they come home and find it in aircraft bombers at an Air Force base in Florida. So it's kind of an interesting film to watch, very much of the Cold War era. But little Thomas wanted there to be a rafting scene in there. Go ahead and go to the next one. And so he called the Hatches to come on over to Pakistan and run the Indus River. So here's a map of the Indus River Basin, India here, right, Nepal and Pakistan. The Indus starts up here in China, flows through India and into Pakistan. And Thomas wanted to go up into the high Himalaya and film up there. So this map that's right here is this section right here on the Indus. So it's pretty high up near the headwaters. It's a long river. And so they flew over to Gol, to this little tiny town. And their first little expedition to kind of see what the Indus was like was to float down to Skardu, this short section. You can run it in a day. And they got out there and they were like, oh, we got to go find something that's way mellower. This is really scary. Don described it as being as bad as lava falls or worse, and continuous. And this is all glacial runoff, so it's really cold. And so that section was done without cameras. There were no cameras with them. It was just a test run. So they took out at Skardu, and they moved over here to the Gilgit River, which is a tributary that comes in right after the Indus makes this little horseshoe bend. And so they float the Gilgit, and then they floated part of the Indus as well. And everything was going well until the last day of filming. The last day of filming, they had one of the actors on the boat with them who had been wanting to go the whole time. They didn't have enough life jackets. The motor on the pontoon boat died, right, and they floated sideways into a hole, and it flipped, and they didn't find the actor ever again. His name was Jim Parker. And Nanga Parbat, one of the major Himalayan peaks, is right here. So his name is up there with the names of all the climbers that are all listed at Rakyat Bridge down here. So the Hatches go to Pakistan. They run the river. Lowell Thomas films it. Go ahead and go to the next one. Uh, they had a couple of scenes that they needed to redo, so they went to Lee's Ferry. Uh, used some Navajos as Pakistanis. Um, and this became the hit of the film. People loved this. They thought it was incredible. And I'll show you, it's a short little 8-minute clip of what was in Search for Paradise on the Indus River. Bear with us with technology here. It's this one. Have you watched this? Its upper reaches, for the most part, still unexplored. A world it defines not only as the highest of mountains, but in its immensity of glaciers lies the greatest assemblage of mighty rivers on this planet. Among them, the Oxus, the Yangtze, the Mekong, the Irrawaddy, the Brahmaputra, the Ganges, and the historic So imagine, they made it, most of them. So imagine 2 hours of that. That's the movie. That's far less exciting. But audiences loved it. Hold on, I'll do questions at the end. Audiences loved this scene. Everybody agreed that the movie was terrible at the time. I think somebody wrote that it was overtalked, untidy, and uncouth. That was the New York Times film reviewer. But it premiered on Broadway. People showed up in like their opera finest, their gowns. And they handed out life jackets at the beginning of the screening. And during this part, people came around with buckets and like dumped buckets of water on you. And people loved it. They're in like their finest, and they thought it was great. So everybody agreed that, the film itself was kind of terrible, but that the rafting scenes were just, out of this world, which is nothing compared to what we think of when we think of adventure films today, and nothing compared to what we'll see on the Indus later. But they actually lost a lot of their footage of the bigger rapids when the boat flipped, and when Parker drowned. So they kind of only had that stuff, but they also couldn't film on a lot of stuff that was much bigger than that. And so go ahead to the next one. So when they returned home, folks knew about Hatch River expeditions. This just added more fuel to the fire for Hatch itself as a business. People knew about them. They were written up in the newspaper. They were flown out with one of their pontoon boats to New York to go rafting on the East River for their premiere. People also loved that. Bus wrote something like, I don't know if I'd call it rafting, but it was something. And during the 1960s, we had this continuing interest in getting outside and experiencing public lands. So you can see this is Georgie White. I'm sure many of you, if not all of you, have heard her name. We see massive increase of recreation on the river. In 1965 on the Grand Canyon, 547 people went down the river. In 1970, there were more than 10,000 people that went down the river in that year. So an exponential increase. I think it increased by 59% every year from 1959 to 1970. We have the Wilderness Act signed, right? I'm sure you all know about Grand Canyon dories. So there's this context, this larger context. You still have people who are more mobile, more prosperous after World War II that are enabling people to get out and explore rivers and get into river rafting. And it's also, folks are starting to look overseas. So in 1969, this guy, Richard Bangs, he's the one kneeling in the front there, he started working for Hatch River Expeditions on the Grand Canyon. He fudged his resume. I had a long conversation with him yesterday, and he said, well, there's a Green River and a Snake River in the East Coast. So I just said I had rafted all of them, and I didn't tell them where exactly those rivers were. So he got hired on with Hatch River Expeditions and started working for Hatch. And while he was there, he went on a trip with Don. Don had the kind of northern part of the business, Dinosaur National Monument, as well as the salmon. And then Ted had the Grand Canyon and Cataract southern area. But Bangs went up to the salmon for a river trip with Don, and while he was on that trip, he asked Don all about the Indus and what that was like. He'd heard stories of it around the boathouses. And as Bangs told me yesterday, he thought he was pretty cool. He could raft the Colorado, and he said, well, I could go and do other stuff around the world. And so he had a childhood friend named John Yost, whose family, his father was a diplomat in Ethiopia. And Yost was going to visit his family, and Bangs said, hey, why don't you check out the rivers over there? And so in 1973, Bangs and Yost went over to Ethiopia and ran the first descent of the Awash River, and then later that year, the Omo River. And from the Omo, when they were trying to get sponsorships to head out on these trips, they needed some money and some backing. They went to the Smithsonian to ask them to chip in some money, chip in some supplies. And the Smithsonian said, well, what's your name? And they didn't have a name, so they had to come up with one very quickly. And so they ended up naming themselves Sobek Expeditions after the crocodile god, because they knew they were going to encounter some wildlife out there. And they did. Go ahead to the next one. On the Omo River in 1973, they were there during the low water time of year, so all the wildlife were out. They saw 4,000 hippos in, I think it was a 2-week-long trip. They also would have hippos, they'd be floating down the river, and all of a sudden their boat would be 4 feet higher in the air. Hippos would stand up under their boat and not know that that was happening. They got attacked by hippos, they got attacked by crocodiles. They had strategies for that. When they saw either one coming, they'd first start throwing rocks. They had rocks in their boats for this purpose. When they got closer, they'd start bashing them over the head with oars. I think they had plenty, but not, fewer than you'd think. They did have both crocs and hippos chomp on their boats and puncture them. So they went through their patching material pretty quickly. But from this came the first international commercial river running company, Sobek Expeditions. And this took off in popularity during the 1970s into the 1980s. They merged with Mountain Travel, which was a trekking and mountaineering travel company in 1991. And they became the first really big commercial rafting company to be overseas. And they went and they ran, go ahead to the next one. After hearing about the Indus for so many years, Banks wanted to get out there and try it. So they went to the Indus River in 1979. And their goal was to connect, if you remember from the hatches put in at Goal and went to Skardu, and then went to the Gilgit River and floated down to Rakyat Bridge. And Banks and his crew wanted to try and connect these points in here from Skardu down to the Gilgit. And this section is called the Rondu Gorge. It's still, I don't think, in the research I've been doing, I don't think anybody's run every rapid on it. Folks have come close, but there's still a lot of portaging through there. And this is something that the Sobek Expeditions found out as well. I think they ended up taking out, right after a rapid called Malupa, which you'll see in a minute, and doing a car shuttle down to the Gilgit because they had spent 3 weeks out there. And they couldn't run every river. They were worn out, they were sick, and they just couldn't portage anymore. So they went down to the confluence with the Gilgit to some calmer water and put their boats back on there. And this is the section that we'll see inside the Indus as well. So boating has continued to grow, both private boaters as well as commercial boaters, into the later 20th century and into the 21st century. So we're going to fast forward a little bit from this 1979 expedition that Bangs was on up to last year, to 2016 on the Indus. There were multiple attempts in between there. There was mostly in the early 2000s with kayakers who were headed down the Indus. But like I said, I don't think anybody has managed to run the whole Rondu Gorge yet. These guys that you'll see, they ran more rapids this year. I just got an email from them in Pakistan yesterday. They ran more of them, but they still haven't run all of them. And so they're looking forward to getting back and trying to complete the whole Rondu Gorge again. It's continuous class 5, which you'll see here in a second.